Kia ora tātou, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, kei raro i te kāhui whitu o Matariki. Nō reira, kei te mihi ki a koe Ross. Yes, ko Maya Abraham tōku ingoa, and I work at Christchurch City Libraries as Paukohi Kohinga Māori, and I'm joined by my colleague Mātakiwi Wakefield. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Ana mihi ki a koutou, I tēnei wā o Matariki. Ko Mātakiwi Wakefield tōku ingoa, no kaitahu ahau, I te taha o tōku pāpa no Te Atiawa, Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Raukawa, Ngāti Mani a Poto, te taha o tōku māma. Yeah, looking forward to this conversation and great to see you, Ross.
Ka pai, e tiwi ai, nā taki mai ana, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Waitangi, ko Whitira e te maunga, ko Raukawa te moana, ko Tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Toa, Ngāti Raukawa, me ngai tahu ngā iwi, ko Ross Calman tōku ingoa. Yeah, very nice to meet you, Maya, and reconnect with you, Mātakiwi, after probably a few years. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to the session too. Kia ora.
Kia ora. All right, well, let's get into it. Our first question is, why did you choose this kaupapa of the Treaty of Waitangi?
Yeah, well, obviously this is a very important kaupapa for this nation. Wasn't the sort of whakapapa of this book, the history of it goes back quite a long way. Probably maybe close to 20 years ago now, I was asked by Reed Publishers to do a book for children and for adults, but an introductory book about the treaty. And that's probably where it all started, because I put that book together and then I became known as someone who knows a bit about the treaty. And so after that, the school journal editor, one of the school journal editors approached me, and I did an article for the school journal. And then that led on to another smaller book that took this graphic novel kind of format, and that was also for schools as well. But everyone who's seen that graphic novel format just knows it's so accessible, and that the publisher, in this case Lift Education, they could just see the potential to reach a wider audience with such an accessible approach to this topic. And so it's kind of quite a long history to the book. But yeah, that's how it came about. It wasn't really my idea to start with. I was a writer interested in history, and the publisher came to me about the book. So yeah, that's how it started.
That's excellent, Ross. I'm just wondering, why is it important? Why do you think it's important to be learning about the treaty at the moment?
Wow, I mean, it's a huge kaupapa. The thing for me about the treaty, well, it's pretty hard to argue against the fact that it's the foundation of our whole nation. So, and a lot of people think that's just about Māori and Pākehā, but really it's a wider story than that. The treaty allows all non-Māori people to live in this country, to be here. It established the basis, the framework for that. So it's funny how a lot of people sort of think of it as being just a Māori issue, the treaty. Oh no, it's just for Māori, but the treaty is very much has a place. Everyone needs to know about the treaty. Everyone who lives in this country obviously has different ramifications for Māori versus non-Māori, but everyone needs to know at least the basics about the treaty, what it's about, and yeah, therefore this book is just part of that education process. So I hope it can contribute to the sort of national conversation about the treaty that needs to just be ongoing. The treaty is signed a long time ago now, but its relevance is still there today, more than ever.
Yeah, and is that important to, that relate it to people today? Because it has been that conversation about Māori and Pākehā, but really it's bigger than that. So, yeah, do you feel like your book, The Treaty of Waitangi, addresses that in some way, or at least reveals some of that for people?
Yeah, I hope so. Firstly, I think, I'm a bit of a history sort of nut myself, so I just find the history side of it quite interesting. Just thinking about Aotearoa as it was in 1840, basically it was a Māori country, and you had a British, a European power who had a global empire, basically trying to negotiate a foothold in this country. So the politics of what happened at that time and how the treaty came to be, for me, that's an interesting story. But then, of course, there's the whole history of what's happened ever since that time as well. So, I personally think, just from a history point of view, it's interesting. I think a lot of people kind of think, oh, the treaty, that's hard, that's a bit of a boring topic. But actually, from every angle, if you just look at the history of what was happening at the time of its creation, right through to the history of what's gone on since, there's a powerful story which is really important to this nation's psyche, and there's still got unresolved issues dating from the treaty that it's in everyone's interest to address, to know about, and so they can have informed conversations about them.
So the way that you said before, the way you've written is it's about the accessibility for people. Why have you done that? Is there a particular community that you're looking at, or particular audience you're trying to target?
Yeah, well, I think this book, as I explained in the background to it, it started off as an introductory book for school students and for adults. And it's even become sort of even slightly more simplified than that, in that it was then recast as a graphic novel and was actually targeted towards people who may have some reading and learning difficulties. So, all that has meant that it's been simplified and made as clear as possible for everyone. And I think that's a great thing, because, a lot of people just think about, if you think about the treaty or about historical topics, you think, oh, that's in the too hard basket. I can't even start to engage with that. But when you can present someone basically like a comic and say, well, here you go, and there's even pictures, a lot of people go, oh, okay, well, I think I might be able to cope with that, because most people have a really positive image of comics. And, even people like me who are right into all their books and reading and research and all that stuff, I started off reading comics just like everyone else. So I think the format is fantastic, and I really love what the publisher's done. Also, have to give a lot of credit to Toby Morris, the illustrator, who's done all those great illustrations and made it so accessible.
Yeah, and just on that, I was just looking at the cover, which I'm not sure if you can see, but it's very colourful. Lots of different faces, and was that a big decision to decide who was going to illustrate, or how did that pairing come up? Was that a
right.
conversation?
It was largely the publisher's job to identify the illustrator, but they did send me the work of about 3 different illustrators, ranging from they're sort of a little slightly different styles. Some of them a little bit more kind of photorealistic, whereas Toby's, I guess, is not quite so realistic, but more, I suppose, cartoony. And I kind of said, I like Toby's style. I think for this book, we don't want to kind of kind of intimidate or put people off with the graphic description. So the look of it. So I really like Toby's style, how open, accessible it is. That's what the publisher went with in the end. So, very happy that they went that way. Yeah, I can't claim any credit for the any of the illustrations, but I think Toby's done a wonderful job.
So just on the writing of the book, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. Which came first, the pictures or the writing, the story? And how long did it take for the book itself to be put together, brought together?
Yeah, so it started very much with the words, which maybe took me a couple of weeks to come up with like the first draft, but it's sort of like, you say, people say, I wrote this book in a week or a day or whatever it is, but it's never really that simple. Like, so you might, you obviously got to do your research. So for me, especially, Claudia Orange's work on the Treaty of Waitangi is obviously the key book in this whole space. So just reading what other people have written and just, my process is just to read quite widely first and not write a single word. And then just let it kind of work away in my brain. And then I set aside some clear time and space where I don't have distractions. So in this case, I remember I wrote this script in a university library where it was very quiet and I just had, I had no distractions. It was actually, no internet or anything like that. I think I actually wrote the first draft longhand, which I don't actually do very often anymore, but it was quite a good way, because I think, it's quite difficult if you're working on a computer and you're getting kind of notifications and so on to actually concentrate on something like writing. But yeah, as I say, so it might have taken, a week or two to write the first draft, but then a book like this, obviously we don't want to put things out that are wrong, or also just we don't want to put things out that are too hard to read or understand what's going on. So there's a whole host of people involved that we send drafts to, like historians and educationalists and so on, and they all, have their input and give their view, and then it all comes, as the writer, you have to consider everyone's point of view, and often, always, you can improve what words you have a lot through that process. And as a writer, you have to kind of just humble yourself and just accept other people's feedback and not take it too critically. Like, it's everyone is just trying to improve what you've got. And then, all that text. There's also the editors at the publishers. They helped because they know how much text to have, with each box of a comic. You've got a real limitation on what can be in each box. So the editors at the publisher have another role too to help get it down to the right size. And then, obviously Toby also wrote the first part of the book, so he sort of put himself into the book as a character. And then also Mark Darby, another historian, he was involved with some of the post-treaty history, or some more recent treaty settlement history content. He was responsible for that part of it. So yeah, it was very much a team effort.
Yeah, and I liked the perspective of Toby at the beginning. That was a nice way to relate it to, the everyday person, and whoever picks it up, they can kind of, trade Toby for themselves. That was a nice moment in the book. Was that considered, or how? Yeah, is that kind of what you intended that to be like?
Yeah, it wasn't really my idea. It was something that Toby came up with, and I ran with it because I agree with you that it's a nice introduction. It's a way, he's got the experience of putting together graphic texts and knows how to hook people in, and I think it works really well. I can't really claim the credit for it though.
In the book, I noticed that one part of it, you talk about the treaty translations.
Oh, yes.
And it seems to be quite highlighted in here about the translations. Why was it really important to highlight those or bring attention to those points?
Yeah, I mean, the two texts of the treaty, some people will say the treaty only has one text, and they'll argue that it's really the Māori text that is the text of the treaty, because the Māori text is the text that was cited by about over 90% of Māori chiefs who signed it, and the English text came later. But the two texts of the treaty are obviously key to a lot of the ongoing discussions and debates about what the treaty means for us today. The process is quite interesting. So obviously, Governor Hobson didn't speak Māori. He had to rely on some missionaries, Henry Williams especially, and his son, who already had lived in New Zealand for some years, and so they had the Māori language. So Governor Hobson obviously knew what he wanted the treaty to achieve, and he came up with an English draft document that people, some people say, oh, well, wasn't the treaty, it was just like the first draft. And he handed it to Henry Williams to translate, and they had just basically one night to do it. So it must have been quite a high-pressured night to turn that into Te Reo Māori. So I suppose what we can say about that is that the two texts of the treaty are quite different. So you've got an English version of the treaty and the Māori version. I suppose what you could say is that the Māori version promises Māori more than what the English version does. And there's debate about how intentional that was. Like, was it because they couldn't quite come to grips with translating certain terms and phrases, or was it actually because they wanted Māori to sign and therefore they conceded more in the Māori text than what they really meant to in the English text? My personal opinion is that it's a classic sales exercise, that they didn't want Māori to refuse it. So in the Māori text, they definitely softened the intent of the English text. So, for example, in the Māori text, they say that Māori will retain tino rangatiratanga. And obviously, if you know, rangatira means chief. Absolute chieftainship is how some people translate that phrase. Obviously, for Māori, that's pretty much saying, I will still be the boss of my house or of my country. And it's said that the British would take over the kāwanatanga, which basically means something like government or governorship. And it's interesting because some people say, well, Māori couldn't know what kāwanatanga was, governorship. But actually they did have a bit of an idea, because there had been a governor in Sydney for 50 years at the time of the treaty. So, and quite a few Māori had been across to Sydney and had seen what went on in Sydney. And so they actually did have an idea that a governor was a Pākehā or an English chief. So I think in some ways they did have their eyes open about that aspect of it. But what they probably couldn't have anticipated was basically the scale that the numbers of settlers who would come in such a short time after the treaty. I think that's the thing, is that because European ships have been coming to New Zealand ever since Sydney had been established, so for roughly 50 years, and Māori had control of that interaction in terms of trade and so on, they could see that kind of situation continuing with maybe a slightly enhanced British presence in terms of a governor and a few soldiers to keep the unruly British subjects in line. So that's probably what they had in mind, and that's basically a fair assumption based on the Māori text. If you go across the English text, though, it doesn't talk about sovereignty. It talks about basically it's more about saying the British will take over sovereignty and Māori will have basically control of or they'll continue to own all their possessions and their lands and so on. So it's a slightly weaker position for Māori if you look at the English text. But yeah, as I say, you've got to remember that none of the Māori who signed were looking at the English text. So yeah, it's interesting. The debate goes on. And I think, you can't have a book about the treaty without discussing some of those points about the language used in the two different language versions of the treaty.
Yeah, and in that same sort of line, you can't really have the conversation as well without speaking about how it's still affecting us. Like, it might have felt like the signing of the treaty was full stop and then we move on, but we're kind of still talking about the treaty and it's still affecting us, and lots of iwi around the country are still fighting for some of the treaty rights, and so is that another important part of having this conversation as well, is how it's still an important part of our daily lives?
Yeah, I mean that's why the treaty's sort of become known as a Māori thing, because basically the government, Pākehā government and so on, largely forgot about the treaty once it was signed and in the bag, so to speak. Basically, they acted and passed laws that completely went against what was in the treaty. And so this is why today, obviously, I suppose Māori are more associated with it because it's sort of saying, hang on a minute, it's your treaty, you actually came out with this treaty, and now you're just pretending it never happened and so on. That's a little bit of an oversimplification. So it's really only probably, I would say, since the 1970s that there's been wider societal kind of focus back on the treaty again. For over 100 years, the treaty was hardly referred to by government, and basically lots of acts of government. We could cite, for example, New Zealand Wars and invasion of Waikato, for example, or we could think about confiscations of lands as a result of those wars. You can think about other things that are not quite as violent but have their own kind of violence, I guess, such as the Public Works Act. So where basically the government passes a law which says we can just take any land we want if we deem that the government, needs it for something such as eroding or a hospital or whatever it might be. So basically, if you look at our history, you can just see a vast succession of acts by our government, basically, that has broken the treaty. This is what led to the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in the 1970s, but that didn't really address the historical issues until probably about, I think, 1986, when their mandate was broadened and they were able to look back to past grievances of people against the treaty. And so then we move into the more recent era that older people will be familiar with, but maybe young people may not know much about what's happened in the last, say, 30 years. Iwi have brought claims, have been able, under the Waitangi Tribunal legislation, have been able to bring claims where they, basically say this legislation or this act by the government was not in the spirit of the treaty, against the treaty, and it's led to a disadvantage for us. And it might be lands, or it might be basically resulted in poverty and a whole lot of other negative effects for our tribe, for our hapu, our sub-tribe. And so then that gets heard by the Waitangi Tribunal. It's like a panel of judges who know about history and law and tikanga Māori and so on. And so that process it's been going on for over 30 years, that process, and it's continuing today, although the focus now is more on kind of thematic issues. I won't go into the technicalities of it too much, but yeah, I mean, it's an important process for the country. A lot, we know now there's a number of iwi have had significant settlements and now have, kind of got business interests and commercially are doing quite well. But we still have the lasting impact of colonisation in terms of just the big disparity between a lot of statistics in terms of Māori, if you compare them with the rest of the country. And so even just from a social equity, and also thinking about the good of the country in terms of economically, if you just want to take a kind of cold-hearted approach to it all, it's these issues do need to be addressed. And yeah, the treaty, I suppose it's it's a way you can't ignore the treaty in terms of moving forward as a way of in terms of addressing these wider issues, which, as I just sort of suggested, are pretty, some pretty broad issues, and I'm not saying that they can be easily solved, but that's just what's still ahead of us as a country to address.
We know the treaty was signed in Waitangi. Was it signed anywhere else? Yeah,
I mean, that's another interesting one, because it's called the Treaty of Waitangi, and so there's a lot of focus on that. What happened at Waitangi on the 6th of February when, dozens of chiefs, mainly from Te Tai Tokerau, signed it, but it did then travel around, went around the whole country in that various people, like naval officers and other people who Governor Hobson sent off, took copies of the treaty to different places and different iwi. So, for example, the Bay of Plenty, down to the Cook Strait region and right down to Murihiku, Ruapuki Island. But so it was taken around and signed quite widely, but at the same time, there were a lot of iwi who didn't sign the treaty as well. So it was taken around, but not everyone signed it, or not everyone who was offered it signed it either. And the other thing to remember too is that for some iwi, other dates are more significant really for them than the 6th of February. Like it might be a date in May, June or July, where a local celebration might be more appropriate than the 6th of February, because that's when the treaty might have come to a certain place. So I think there's 9 sheets of the treaty, each having some signatures, and in total there's I think there's just over 500 signatures in total, and of those I believe it's between about 6 and 10 are women, which is quite interesting. But there's some, the identity of some signatories is not absolutely being determined.
Yeah, in the book there's a really great map of Aotearoa and where the treaty was signed, which, growing up you kind of think, one day Treaty of Waitangi, but, the logistics of signing the treaty at all those places in one day is not possible. So that's great map to kind of realise the magnitude of signing a treaty. But then also, you've written it in Te Reo Māori and English. And you can do a really cool thing if you hold it this way. You've got the Māori version and you just flip it over and you've got the English version, which is really cool. And why have you done that?
Well, I didn't write the Te Reo Māori text. The publisher, it was the publisher's idea, but I mean, Te Reo Māori is our official language, and obviously with a kaupapa like this, it's very appropriate that it be in both languages. We had a friend in relation to mine, Piripi Walker, do the translation into Te Reo Māori. And I think it's just appropriate, and it, the treaty itself has a Māori and English text, so it's very appropriate that this book should have Māori and English text as well. So it's I think it's great too. Just another way of accessing the content, and hopefully will be embraced by Māori medium school settings.
Ross, just in closing, we're just wondering, is there anything you would like to add or touch on that we haven't touched on so far?
I suppose it's probably the point I sort of made near the beginning, which is that I really hope that as a result of this book, that people realise that the treaty does have relevance to everyone in this country, that it's not just for Māori, that hopefully if they do see this book, they'll pick it up and read it. I look forward to the conversations that we can all have as a result of knowing a bit about the treaty and its ongoing ramifications for us all. So that's my biggest hope with putting this book out there. And also want to thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion here this morning.
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's all of our questions. But it was really lovely to talk to you, and really great to, hear from you about the intentions of this book, this really great book, the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So, ko tēnei te mihi kia koe, Ross, no reira tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe Maia, koro ko Mata Kiwi. Ka nui te mihi ki a korua. Mō tā tātou whakawhiti kōrero i te ata nei, no reira. Tēnā koro o tira, tēnā tātou katoa.